The world thought the rusty truck was the least valuable thing the billionaire heiress owned. By sunset, everyone would realize it was the greatest gift she could ever give. The October air carried the crisp scent of fallen maple leaves as Caleb Dawson guided his weathered blue pickup into the gravel lot outside Ashford Estate, nearly 40 miles north of Indianapolis. His truck rattled softly before settling into silence beside rows of polished luxury SUVs, spotless collector cars, and expensive trailers waiting to haul away pieces of a billionaire's legacy. Caleb adjusted the faded denim jacket over his flannel shirt before glancing toward the passenger seat, where a folded grocery list rested beside a worn family photograph. His 12-year-old daughter, Lily, had slipped the picture into his pocket that morning with a quiet smile. "Maybe you'll find something cool for the garage, Dad." He smiled at the memory. She always believed ordinary days could become unforgettable. Caleb wasn't there chasing fortune. His small restoration shop survived month to month repairing pickups, tractors, and aging American classics for hardworking neighbors. He had come hoping to find affordable tools, maybe an old transmission, perhaps a few vintage Ford parts that larger collectors would overlook. The Ashford Estate auction was famous across Indiana because nothing had been touched since Charles Ashford passed away nearly 2 years earlier. The billionaire industrialist had collected everything from antique tractors to handcrafted furniture, yet rumors whispered that his daughter had delayed selling anything because she couldn't bear to let go. As Caleb signed the registration sheet, conversations floated through the crowd. "They say every item here is worth a fortune. Even the junk probably costs more than my house. Wait until you see the old truck behind the barn. Biggest eyesore on the property." Caleb followed the sound of laughter until he spotted it sitting beneath an aging oak tree. Time had not been kind to the old 1972 Ford F-100. Rust climbed across the faded green body like autumn vines. One headlight was cracked. The windshield carried years of dust. Flat tires had nearly disappeared into the earth itself. Most bidders barely glanced at it before walking toward shinier prizes. Caleb didn't. He stepped closer, slowly circling the truck with the quiet patience of someone who listened before speaking. His fingertips brushed gently across the dented fender. Under layers of neglect, he noticed perfectly straight body lines. Original chrome. Factory mirrors. Someone had cared deeply for this truck once. Someone had simply stopped having the chance. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a calm voice asked behind him. Caleb turned to see a woman standing several feet away, dressed not in designer glamour, but in a simple cream sweater, dark jeans, and brown leather boots dusted with gravel. Her blonde hair moved gently in the cool breeze, and although cameras followed her from a respectful distance, there was sadness in her gray eyes that no amount of wealth could hide. "Only if you know where to look," Caleb answered. "Most people see rust." "And you?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "I see a man who washed it every Sunday afternoon." The woman blinked. For the first time that morning, the practiced expression she wore slipped away. "How could you possibly know that?" Caleb looked back toward the truck. The chrome wasn't polished by accident. Neither was the steering wheel. The wear tells a story. Whoever owned this loved driving it, not displaying it. She folded her arms, studying him with growing curiosity. "My father never missed a Sunday." The words came so quietly they almost disappeared into the wind. Caleb looked at her again, recognition settling across his face. "You're Victoria Ashford." She nodded once. "I am." Before Caleb could respond, an auction coordinator hurried toward them holding a clipboard. "Miss Ashford, we're ready to begin the vehicle presentations." She looked at the clipboard, then back at Caleb, then finally toward the forgotten truck. Around them, bidders gathered, eager for million-dollar automobiles and rare collectibles. Hardly anyone noticed the rusted pickup waiting beneath the old oak tree. Victoria took one slow breath, as though gathering courage she had searched for over 2 years. Then she spoke, words that caused every nearby conversation to stop. "That truck isn't going to auction," she said. "I'm giving it to him." Silence settled across the estate like the last light before sunset. No one understood why the richest woman in the county had just handed her late father's forgotten truck to a stranger she had known for less than 2 minutes. Caleb didn't understand either. But somewhere beneath decades of rust, a promise neither of them had expected was quietly beginning to awaken. Caleb Dawson drove home with the old Ford F-100 following behind on a borrowed trailer. and for nearly the entire 40-mile drive, he could not make sense of what had happened. Every few miles he glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting the truck to disappear, like the kind of impossible story people told over coffee, but never actually lived. The rust-covered body bounced gently with every crack in the highway, carrying decades of silence behind it. By the time he turned onto the narrow gravel road leading to his modest repair shop outside the small town of Millbrook, the late afternoon sun had settled into long golden beams stretching across harvested cornfields. The weathered sign above the garage read Dawson Auto Restoration, its faded paint peeling around the edges, just like many of the vehicles Caleb worked so hard to save. Before he could even switch off the engine, the front door opened, and Lily hurried outside wearing paint-speckled sneakers and an oversized gray sweatshirt. Her eyes grew wide the moment she spotted the truck. "Dad, you actually bought it?" she called, stopping beside the trailer with genuine excitement instead of disappointment. Caleb climbed down and smiled. "No, someone gave it to us." Lily laughed softly because it sounded impossible. Nobody gives away trucks. Apparently someone does. Together they carefully rolled the old Ford into the garage. The familiar scent of motor oil, sawdust, coffee, and clean steel filled the quiet building. Sunlight slipped through the high windows, illuminating tiny dust particles that drifted slowly above the workbench. Caleb walked around the truck again, this time without the noise of the auction crowd. Surrounding him, the silence allowed him to notice details he had missed before. Every dent seemed honest. Every scratch looked earned. The steering wheel leather had worn smooth where steady hands had rested for thousands of miles. Lily climbed onto a stool beside him. "It looks tired," she whispered. Caleb nodded. "Sometimes people do too." He reached beneath the hood and carefully released the latch. The hinges groaned as the hood lifted. The engine compartment was coated in years of dust, but remained surprisingly complete. Nothing appeared stripped for parts. Nothing suggested neglect before the truck had been parked away. It was as though someone had simply closed the hood one final time and never returned. Caleb removed an old shop towel from his pocket and gently wiped dirt from the valve cover. "Whoever owned this respected machines," he murmured. "They fixed things instead of replacing them." Lily watched quietly before asking the question lingering in her mind. "Why would that lady give it to us?" Caleb rested both hands against the fender. "I do not think she was trying to give away a truck." "Then what was she giving away?" He looked toward the fading sunlight beyond the garage door. Maybe a memory she could not carry anymore. The answer stayed with him long after Lily returned inside to finish her homework. As evening settled across the property, another pickup eased into the driveway. Caleb recognized the black SUV following behind it before the headlights even switched off. Victoria Ashford stepped out wearing the same simple sweater from earlier, though now she carried a small cardboard box against her chest. She hesitated before entering the garage, almost as though the building itself demanded quiet respect. "I hope I am not interrupting," she said. Caleb shook his head. "Not at all." Her eyes settled immediately on the truck. She smiled sadly when she saw the hood standing open. "You wasted no time. I wanted to understand what I had been trusted with." Victoria looked down at the box in her hands. "That is why I came." She carefully placed it on the workbench. Inside were an old owner's manual, several faded registration papers, 2 rusted ignition keys attached to a worn leather keychain, and a small stack of maintenance receipts stretching back almost 30 years. Caleb gently lifted the papers one by one. Every oil change had been recorded in neat handwriting. Every repair carried careful notes in blue ink. "Your father kept everything," Caleb said. Victoria nodded with a quiet smile. He believed every mile mattered because every mile became part of a person's story. Her voice softened even more. "After he passed away, I could not even open this box. Every receipt reminded me that there would never be another one." Neither of them spoke for several moments. The ticking of the old wall clock echoed gently through the garage while evening crickets began singing outside. Finally, Victoria looked directly at Caleb. "Would you promise me something?" "If I can. Do not restore it into something it never was. Let it keep its history. My father always said the most beautiful things are the ones that remember where they have been." Caleb closed the owner's manual carefully before meeting her eyes. "I promise. I will not erase its life. I will simply help it keep going." For the first time since arriving, Victoria's guarded expression softened into genuine relief. and somewhere deep inside the quiet old garage, two strangers discovered they were no longer protecting only a forgotten truck. They were protecting the memory of a father who had quietly believed that the right person would someday understand exactly what he was leaving behind. The next morning arrived with a pale silver sky hanging over Millbrook, and Caleb Dawson unlocked the garage before sunrise as he had every weekday for the past 15 years. The familiar creak of the rolling door echoed through the quiet building, while cool autumn air drifted inside, carrying the scent of damp leaves and fresh earth. The old Ford sat exactly where he had left it, still wearing its faded green paint and patches of rust with quiet dignity. Caleb poured a cup of black coffee, placed it on the workbench, and stood silently in front of the truck for several moments. He never rushed the beginning of a restoration. Machines had stories, and stories deserved patience. Lily appeared a few minutes later with a notebook tucked beneath her arm before leaving for school. She smiled as she ran her fingertips gently across the dusty hood. "It already looks happier," she whispered. Caleb chuckled softly. "Nothing has changed yet." She tilted her head. "Maybe somebody finally believes it is worth saving." Those words stayed with him long after the school bus disappeared around the bend. Caleb slipped on his work gloves and began carefully removing years of dirt one gentle section at a time. He did not attack the rust with grinders or chemicals. Instead, he used soft brushes, warm water, and clean cloths, revealing details hidden beneath decades of neglect. The original Ford emblem slowly emerged beneath layers of dust. The chrome trim reflected tiny streaks of morning sunlight. Every clean surface seemed to breathe again. Around noon, a sleek black SUV rolled quietly into the driveway. Victoria Ashford stepped out carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and a small bakery box. She paused outside the open garage, watching Caleb work without interrupting him. He had not noticed her arrival. His attention remained completely fixed on polishing a weathered door handle with remarkable care. She waited another minute before speaking. "Most people would have replaced that piece already." Caleb looked up with an easy smile. "Most people are usually in a hurry." He accepted the coffee with grateful hands. Victoria walked slowly around the truck, noticing small sections that now shined beneath the rust. "I thought restoration meant making everything look brand new." Caleb shook his head. "Only if you forget why it mattered in the first place." He gently pointed toward a shallow scratch beneath the driver's side window. "See this mark?" Victoria leaned closer. "I remember asking my father about it when I was little." Caleb smiled. "He probably told you exactly how it happened." Her eyes softened. "A fence post during a camping trip in Colorado. He said leaving the scratch was cheaper than forgetting the vacation." Caleb nodded. "Then it stays." Victoria looked at him with quiet surprise. "You are keeping the damage?" "I am keeping the memory." She did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched him continue working with calm, deliberate movements. Every bolt he removed was labeled. Every piece of hardware was cleaned by hand before being placed into organized trays. Nothing was discarded unless it truly could not be saved. It reminded her less of automotive work and more of someone restoring a family photograph, one careful corner at a time. She finally reached into her purse and placed an envelope on the workbench. "Please take this." Caleb glanced inside without touching it. A cashier's check rested neatly within. The amount was enough to replace every piece of equipment in his garage and still leave money in the bank. He quietly closed the envelope and slid it back toward her. "I cannot accept that." Victoria frowned. "You have not even looked at the number." "I do not need to." "Why?" she asked gently. "Because this truck was already a gift. Charging you to care for your father's memory would make it feel like business." She looked almost puzzled. "Everybody charges for their time." Caleb smiled with quiet confidence. "I charge my customers. This is different." The garage fell silent except for the soft ticking of cooling metal. Victoria stared at the envelope resting between them as though it belonged to another world entirely. Throughout her life, money had solved nearly every problem before anyone finished explaining it. Yet this man standing in worn boots and faded work clothes had refused more money than many people earned in an entire year without hesitation or pride. He simply believed some things were worth more than payment. As afternoon sunlight spilled through the windows, Victoria found herself studying Caleb instead of the truck. There was no performance in his kindness, no attempt to impress her, no expectation of reward. He worked with the same quiet care whether anyone was watching or not. Before leaving, she rested one hand lightly against the old fender. My father used to say character is revealed by how someone treats things that cannot repay them. Caleb looked up from the engine compartment and smiled. Your father sounds like a man I wish I had known. Victoria held his gaze for a long moment before quietly answering. I think that is exactly why he wanted the truck to find you. As she drove away, Caleb returned to his work without another thought about the envelope she had taken home. But Victoria carried something far more valuable than the untouched check. For the first time since losing her father, she had met someone who understood that the greatest restorations were never about metal or paint. They were about preserving the quiet goodness that time could never rust away. 3 days later, the garage had settled into an easy rhythm that felt almost timeless. The old Ford no longer looked abandoned. It still carried every scar earned across decades of faithful service. Yet beneath the carefully cleaned metal, there was a quiet confidence beginning to return. Caleb Dawson believed every restoration reached a moment when the vehicle itself decided whether it wanted to tell the rest of its story. That morning arrived with steady rain tapping softly against the tin roof, while warm yellow lights reflected across the garage floor. Caleb had removed the interior door panels one piece at a time, carefully preserving every original clip and screw. He avoided forcing old materials because patience almost always revealed what strength could not. Lily sat nearby, finishing homework at the office desk, occasionally looking up as her father worked in peaceful silence. Do you ever get tired of going so slowly? She asked. Caleb smiled, without looking away from the truck. Slow is how you notice the things everyone else misses. He gently loosened one final rusted fastener inside the driver's side door. The metal panel shifted slightly before stopping against something hidden beneath it. Caleb frowned with quiet curiosity. That should not be there. He reached carefully into the narrow opening, feeling something wrapped in aging oilcloth. Whatever it was had been protected from moisture for many years. He slowly lifted out a flat package no larger than a notebook. Lily pushed back her chair and walked closer. What is it? Caleb brushed away decades of dust before carefully unfolding the brittle cloth. Inside rested a sealed, cream-colored envelope with elegant handwriting across the front. It read simply, "For Victoria." His expression immediately grew serious. He did not attempt to open it. Instead, he stared at the envelope for a long, silent moment before placing it gently upon the workbench. Lily whispered, "It was hidden all this time." Caleb nodded. Someone wanted to make certain only the right person would find it. He reached for his telephone and dialed the number Victoria had written on the back of one of the maintenance receipts. She answered after the second ring. "Is everything all right?" she asked, concern immediately filling her voice. "Yes," Caleb replied calmly. "But I think your father left something inside the truck that belongs only to you." Less than an hour later, Victoria arrived wearing a navy raincoat, tiny drops of water glistening across her shoulders as she stepped inside the warm garage. Caleb said nothing. He simply handed her the untouched envelope. The moment she recognized her father's handwriting, her breath caught. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly as she traced the familiar letters with quiet disbelief. "I have not seen his handwriting since before the funeral," she whispered. Caleb stepped back, giving her privacy without needing to be asked. The garage became almost perfectly still except for rain falling gently outside. Victoria carefully opened the envelope and unfolded several neatly written pages. As her eyes moved across the first lines, tears quietly gathered but never fell. She read silently for several minutes before lowering the pages against her chest. Caleb waited without speaking. Finally, she looked toward him. "Would you mind if I read part of it aloud?" "It is your letter," Caleb answered gently. "Whatever feels right." She drew one slow breath and began. "My dearest Victoria, if you are reading this, then life has carried my old truck farther than I ever could. I did not hide this letter because I wanted a secret. I hid it because some gifts must wait until the right heart discovers them. If you are choosing who receives this truck, do not give it to the wealthiest bidder or the finest collector. Give it to the person who sees value before polish, who respects work more than status, and who understands that worn hands often protect the greatest treasures. That person will care for this truck better than money ever could." Victoria stopped reading as emotion filled the quiet room. She looked at Caleb with eyes reflecting both sorrow and peace. I never told anyone what happened at the auction, she said softly. Not even my board of directors. I chose you because something inside me said my father would have trusted you. Caleb lowered his eyes respectfully. Maybe he already did. Victoria unfolded the final page. At the bottom, her father had written one last sentence in steady blue ink. When you find the right caretaker, do not thank him with money. Thank him by letting him remind you that goodness still exists. Neither of them spoke after that. The rain continued its gentle rhythm above the garage, while the old Ford stood quietly between them, no longer simply an aging truck waiting to be restored. It had become the final conversation between a father and his daughter, carried safely through time until two strangers with patient hearts were ready to hear every word. The discovery of the letter spread farther than either Caleb Dawson or Victoria Ashford expected, although neither of them had shared it with anyone beyond Lily. Small towns had a quiet way of noticing unusual things. People driving past the garage slowed down just enough to glimpse the old Ford sitting beneath warm lights each evening. Customers waiting for oil changes asked polite questions. A local newspaper photographer stopped by hoping to capture a picture of the billionaire's forgotten truck finding a second life. Caleb answered every question with the same gentle smile. It is not about the truck. It never was. Most people nodded politely, but few truly understood. By the following week, the telephone inside Dawson Auto Restoration rang more often than it had in months. Some callers wanted interviews. Others offered restoration contracts for classic cars. A few simply wanted to know whether the rumors about the Ashford family were true. Caleb declined every interview with quiet gratitude. He had spent many years teaching Lily that character grew best away from applause. One cool Thursday afternoon, a polished black luxury sedan eased into the gravel parking lot. A sharply dressed gentleman stepped out carrying a leather briefcase and an umbrella, although the skies were perfectly clear. He introduced himself as Richard Ellison, a private collector representing several prominent automotive museums across the Midwest. His voice was friendly, practiced, and respectful. Mr. Dawson, thank you for seeing me. Caleb wiped his hands on a clean shop towel before offering a handshake. What can I help you with? Richard slowly walked around the truck, admiring the careful progress already visible beneath the fading paint. I have restored automobiles for over 25 years, he said. I rarely see someone preserve originality with this level of restraint. Caleb simply nodded. Every truck tells you how much it wants changed. Richard smiled appreciatively before opening his briefcase. Inside rested several neatly prepared documents. I represent a client who has followed this story closely. He would like to purchase the truck exactly as it sits today. Caleb looked toward the papers without reaching for them. It is not for sale. Richard continued calmly. My client is prepared to offer $750,000. The garage fell completely silent. Outside, dry autumn leaves drifted across the driveway in the afternoon breeze. Lily, who had been organizing shelves nearby after school, quietly looked toward her father with wide eyes. The amount exceeded everything Caleb had ever imagined earning in years of honest work. Richard mistook the silence for consideration. If necessary, he added gently, the offer can be increased. Caleb walked slowly toward the truck and rested one weathered hand against the driver's door. He smiled with quiet appreciation before turning back toward the visitor. You are offering an extraordinary amount of money. Richard nodded confidently. Then why refuse? Caleb glanced toward the old steering wheel visible through the window. Because I was never given this truck to become wealthy. Richard looked genuinely puzzled. Everyone has a price, Mr. Dawson. Caleb shook his head kindly. No, everyone has values. Sometimes they cost more than money can afford. For a moment, neither man spoke. Richard slowly closed the briefcase. His expression changed from confident negotiation to sincere respect. May I ask one final question? Caleb nodded. If someone offered twice as much? Caleb smiled exactly as he had throughout the conversation. The answer would still protect the promise instead of my bank account. Richard extended his hand once again. Then I believe your reputation is entirely deserved. After the collector departed, Lily walked over and leaned beside her father. Were you tempted? She asked honestly. Caleb looked around the little garage that had sheltered their family through difficult years. The old coffee maker still rattled every morning. The roof still leaked during heavy spring storms. Some tools had been repaired more times than replaced. There were certainly easier lives that money could have purchased. Yet he smiled with complete peace. Of course I was, he admitted softly. But your grandmother used to tell me that the easiest decision is rarely the one you remember with pride. Lily slipped her hand into his. I think Grandpa Charles would have smiled today. Caleb looked back toward the old truck, standing quietly beneath the evening light. I hope so. At that very moment, several miles away inside the glass offices of Ashford Industries, Victoria received a message informing her that one of the country's most influential collectors had failed to purchase her father's truck despite offering nearly $750,000. She closed the message without replying and slowly looked through her office window toward the setting sun. For the first time since inheriting her father's empire, she realized his greatest investment had never been factories, buildings, or fortunes. It had been learning to recognize the rare people whose hearts could not be purchased, no matter how generous the offer. By the second week of November, the old garage had begun to feel different in ways that had nothing to do with fresh paint or polished chrome. The truck still rested on its jack stands with much of its restoration unfinished, yet laughter now found its way into the building almost every afternoon. Victoria Ashford had quietly made a habit of stopping by after meetings whenever her schedule allowed. She never arrived with photographers, assistants, or security. Sometimes she carried coffee from the small diner downtown. Other times, she brought homemade cookies that she admitted she had only recently learned to bake from an old recipe box that had belonged to her mother. Caleb Dawson accepted every visit with the same quiet gratitude, never treating her differently because of her wealth. Inside the garage, titles disappeared. There was no billionaire heiress and no struggling mechanic. There were simply 3 people and one old truck slowly finding new life together. Lily especially looked forward to those afternoons. She had discovered that Victoria knew surprisingly little about ordinary small-town life despite having grown up only an hour away. One Saturday, she convinced Victoria to help organize shelves filled with old carburetors, spark plugs, and coffee cans packed with carefully labeled bolts. Victoria laughed when she accidentally mixed 2 trays together, and Caleb smiled as Lily patiently explained the difference between the parts with the confidence of someone who had grown up inside a repair shop. You are a very good teacher, Victoria told her. Lily shrugged with a grin. Dad says if you know something, you should help somebody else learn it. Victoria glanced toward Caleb, who was carefully rebuilding the truck's original carburetor beneath a bright work lamp. Your father gives wise advice. Lily smiled proudly. He does not always know he is being wise. Caleb laughed quietly without looking up. That is probably true. Later that afternoon, the 3 of them shared sandwiches on folding chairs outside the garage, while a cool breeze carried the scent of pine and dry leaves across the fields. A freight train rumbled faintly several miles away, and the peaceful rhythm of rural Indiana settled gently around them. Victoria looked toward the open garage, where the old Ford waited patiently beneath. Soft afternoon light. When I was a little girl, she said thoughtfully, my father used to take me fishing in that truck almost every Saturday. I hated getting up before sunrise. Lily giggled. Then why did you go? Victoria smiled at the memory. Because he promised pancakes afterward. Caleb looked up with a quiet smile. Some promises are worth waking up early for. Victoria nodded. I did not realize until years later that the fishing never mattered very much to him. It was the conversation during the drive. Her voice softened. Some mornings we hardly caught anything at all. Caleb folded the wrapper from his sandwich with careful hands. The best trips usually have very little to do with the destination. The conversation drifted comfortably into silence. No one hurried to fill it. The breeze gently stirred the branches overhead, while sunlight reflected across the weathered hood of the truck. Victoria realized she had not experienced this kind of peaceful quiet in years. Her life inside corporate boardrooms was filled with constant schedules, presentations, negotiations, and decisions that affected thousands of employees. Yet here, sitting beside a father and daughter who measured success by honest work and shared meals, time seemed to move at a kinder pace. As evening approached, Lily disappeared briefly into the house before returning with an old family photograph tucked inside a simple wooden frame. She handed it to Victoria with both hands. This is my favorite picture of my mom, she said softly. Victoria accepted it carefully. The photograph showed a younger Caleb standing beside his late wife and a tiny Lily, who could not have been more than 3 years old. All three were smiling beside a Christmas tree decorated with handmade ornaments. She had a beautiful smile, Victoria whispered. Caleb looked at the photograph for a long moment before nodding. She believed people should leave every place a little warmer than they found it. Victoria looked back toward the garage, then toward Lily, and finally toward Caleb. Something inside her quietly shifted. She had spent years believing that grief only took things away. Yet somehow this family had taught her that love could continue growing long after loss if someone chose kindness instead of bitterness. As the sun slowly disappeared below the horizon, the old Ford remained exactly where it had been that morning, still unfinished, still waiting, yet surrounded now by something far more valuable than polished metal. Without anyone saying it aloud, the truck had begun restoring more than memories. It was gently building a family that none of them had expected to find, one quiet afternoon at a time. The first Saturday in December arrived beneath a clear blue Indiana sky, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades the old Ford rested on all 4 wheels again. Caleb Dawson stepped back from the workbench and quietly removed his glasses, studying the truck with the thoughtful expression of a man finishing a conversation rather than a project. The faded green paint had been carefully preserved instead of replaced. Every original emblem had been polished until it reflected the morning sunlight. The small scratch beneath the driver's side window remained exactly where it had always been, untouched because memories deserve the same respect as metal. Even the worn leather bench seat had been repaired rather than exchanged, allowing every crease to continue telling its story. Lily slowly walked around the truck with quiet amazement. "It still looks like Grandpa Charles's truck," she whispered. Caleb smiled. That was always the goal. A few minutes later, Victoria Ashford arrived carrying a long garment bag and a small wooden box. She stopped the moment she saw the finished truck waiting outside the garage. Her eyes filled with emotion before she even reached it. She rested one trembling hand against the hood, closing her eyes for just a moment as if listening for a familiar voice carried somewhere inside the cool morning air. "It looks exactly like I remember," she said softly. Caleb shook his head. "Not exactly. Time still belongs to it." Victoria looked closer and smiled through quiet tears. "You left the scratch. Your father earned that scratch." She laughed gently. "Yes, he did." Caleb reached into the cab and turned the original ignition key with slow, careful hands. The restored engine came to life with a deep, steady rumble that filled the little property without overwhelming the peaceful silence surrounding it. The sound was confident rather than loud, like an old friend clearing his throat after years of waiting. Victoria instinctively covered her mouth. "I have not heard that engine since the week before he passed away." Lily looked between them with a bright smile. "I think it sounds happy." Before anyone could answer, several vehicles turned into the gravel driveway. They were not television crews or collectors. They were neighbors. The owner of the diner, the retired mail carrier, farmers whose tractors Caleb had repaired through difficult harvest seasons, families who had quietly heard that the truck was finally finished. Each person stepped out carrying something simple: homemade pie, fresh coffee, folding chairs, Christmas cookies. Nobody had been invited, yet everyone somehow understood they were witnessing something important. Victoria watched the gathering with quiet surprise. "Did you organize this?" she asked Caleb. He shook his head. Small towns have their own way of showing up. As everyone settled around the garage, Victoria opened the wooden box she had carried from her vehicle. Inside rested her father's old fishing hat, worn smooth around the brim from years of Saturday mornings beside quiet lakes. She gently placed it on the passenger seat of the truck. No one spoke. Even the children standing nearby seemed to sense that some moments became more meaningful when left undisturbed. After a long silence, Victoria turned toward the neighbors. "My father believed success was measured by what people remembered after you left a room." She glanced at Caleb. "I used to think he meant boardrooms and business meetings." Her smile softened. "Now I know he meant places like this." She reached into her coat pocket and removed a folded sheet of paper. Next Friday evening, Ashford Industries is hosting its annual holiday gathering. Every executive, employee, community leader, and member of our foundation board will be there. She looked directly at Caleb. "I would like you to drive this truck there." Caleb blinked in surprise. "Me? Yes." "I would be completely out of place." Victoria smiled gently. "No. This truck belongs with the man who reminded me what my father wanted people to remember. Caleb looked toward the old Ford, then toward Lily, who nodded with quiet encouragement before he even asked what she thought. Finally, he smiled. If it honors your father, I will be there. Victoria looked once more at the truck glowing beneath the winter sun. It will do much more than honor him. She paused as the engine continued its calm, steady rhythm. It is about to remind an entire room that the greatest inheritance any person leaves behind is not measured in dollars. It is measured by the character they recognize in someone else. Around them, the neighbors applauded softly, not because a truck had been restored, but because everyone present understood that something far more remarkable had quietly reached completion. The metal had been repaired weeks before. On that peaceful December morning, it was 3 waiting hearts that had finally found their way home. The following Friday evening, the headquarters of Ashford Industries glowed beneath thousands of warm white lights that reflected across polished glass and freshly fallen snow. Luxury sedans lined the entrance while executives, community leaders, charitable partners, and longtime employees gathered beneath towering evergreen decorations inside the grand atrium. Conversations filled the room with easy confidence as guests admired elegant holiday displays and exchanged stories about another successful year. Then the sound of a familiar vintage engine rolled quietly across the circular driveway. One by one, conversations faded. Heads turned toward the entrance where the restored Ford slowly came to a gentle stop beneath the front canopy. It did not shine because it had become something new. It drew every eye because it still carried the quiet honesty of everything it had lived through. Caleb Dawson stepped out wearing a clean navy sport coat over his flannel shirt, looking slightly uncomfortable beneath so many curious glances. Lily followed beside him in a simple winter dress with a bright smile that made the evening feel instantly warmer. Victoria Ashford walked down the front steps to greet them herself. Without saying a word, she wrapped Caleb in a grateful embrace before turning toward Lily. You both made it. Lily looked proudly toward the truck. Dad said Grandpa Charles would probably like seeing it here. Victoria smiled softly. I think he already does. Together, they entered the grand ballroom, where nearly 500 guests waited beneath crystal chandeliers. The restored truck remained visible through the tall glass windows, parked just outside like an honored guest rather than an exhibit. Many executives whispered to one another, wondering why an old pickup occupied the most prestigious place in front of the building instead of the newest luxury vehicles. Victoria stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone before allowing the room to settle into complete silence. Tonight, she began calmly, I plan to speak about quarterly growth, charitable giving, and another successful year for our company. She paused, looking toward the truck outside the windows. Instead, I want to tell you about my father. The room grew still. Many people believed his greatest legacy was the company he built. They were wrong. She reached into a folder and carefully unfolded the letter Caleb had discovered hidden inside the truck. A few weeks ago, this letter was found inside my father's old pickup after remaining unseen for many years. She looked toward Caleb, standing quietly beside Lily near the back of the ballroom. It changed my understanding of everything he hoped to leave behind. Victoria read the final portion aloud, her voice steady and warm. When you find the right caretaker, do not thank him with money. Thank him by letting him remind you that goodness still exists. No one interrupted. No phones rang. No glasses clinked. Hundreds of people simply listened. Victoria folded the letter and continued. Several collectors offered extraordinary amounts of money for that truck. Every offer was refused, not because it was valuable, but because a promise was worth more. She smiled toward Caleb. The man who restored my father's truck also restored something inside me that I believed was gone forever. He reminded me that integrity still exists when nobody is watching. She invited Caleb to join her on stage. He hesitated before quietly walking forward while Lily watched with shining eyes. Victoria faced the audience once more. Beginning next spring, Ashford Industries will establish the Charles Ashford Restoration Fellowship. It will provide tools, training, scholarships, and restoration grants for veterans, single parents, and small-town craftsmen who preserve American history through honest work. Gentle applause began before growing throughout the ballroom. Victoria raised one hand, asking for another moment. I have also asked Caleb Dawson to lead the fellowship as its founding director because I cannot imagine anyone who better represents the values my father hoped would outlive him. Caleb stood speechless for several seconds before quietly answering, "I am honored, but only if we remember that this program is not about me." He looked around the silent room. Every community already has people doing quiet good work every single day. Sometimes they simply need someone willing to notice. When he stepped away from the microphone, the applause returned, stronger than before, but what lingered far longer than the sound was the silence that came first. It was the kind of silence that only appeared when people recognized a truth too meaningful to interrupt. And beyond the ballroom windows, the old Ford rested peacefully beneath the winter stars, no longer carrying only the memory of one remarkable father, but now carrying the hope that his quiet wisdom would continue changing lives for generations yet to come. 6 months passed quietly, and spring returned to Indiana with fields painted green and mornings filled with birdsong instead of winter winds. Dawson Auto Restoration looked much the same from the road, but inside, something remarkable had taken root. Young apprentices worked beside experienced mechanics, veterans carefully restored forgotten American classics, and single parents who had once believed new opportunities belonged only to other people now discovered steady hands and patient hearts could build new futures. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign that read Charles Ashford Restoration Fellowship. It was not polished or expensive. Caleb Dawson insisted that it be built from reclaimed oak because, as he often reminded everyone, the strongest things were not always the newest. Every Friday afternoon, the old Ford rested outside beneath the same maple tree beside the garage, while visitors stopped simply to admire it. Some came because they loved classic trucks. Others came because they had heard the story behind it. Caleb always welcomed them with the same quiet smile before gently correcting anyone who praised his work too much. The truck was never the miracle, he would say. It simply helped people find one another. Victoria Ashford visited often, though never with an announcement. Sometimes she arrived wearing jeans and work gloves, helping sand old wooden benches for the fellowship workshop. Other afternoons, she sat with Lily on the porch, listening to stories about school, while sharing homemade lemonade beneath the warm spring sun. The distance that had once separated wealth from ordinary life had quietly disappeared. Nobody treated Victoria like a billionaire anymore. Around the garage, she was simply Victoria, someone who never forgot to bring extra coffee and who always remembered everyone's birthday. One Saturday morning, the fellowship welcomed its first graduating class. 12 people stood proudly inside the restored workshop holding certificates they had earned through months of patient work. Families filled folding chairs while neighbors brought homemade pies, fresh bread, and flowers picked from nearby gardens. There were no flashing cameras or national reporters. The celebration belonged to the community that had quietly built it together. Victoria stepped forward carrying the same wooden box that had once held her father's fishing hat. She placed it gently upon a small table beside the old Ford before looking toward Caleb. "There is one more thing my father left behind," she said softly. She opened the box and removed a weathered leather journal. "I found this while organizing his study last month." It was hidden inside the back of a bookshelf. Caleb accepted it carefully. Inside were years of handwritten reflections about business, family, faith, and ordinary kindness. Tucked between the final pages rested one sentence written only weeks before Charles Ashford passed away. Victoria read it aloud with calm, steady warmth. "If the greatest thing my daughter inherits is money, then I have failed her. If she inherits the ability to recognize goodness in ordinary people, then I will always remain part of her life." A deep silence settled across the gathering. Several people lowered their eyes. Others quietly smiled. Nobody hurried to speak because some truths deserved room to breathe. Victoria closed the journal before turning toward Caleb. He was right. I did inherit something far greater. Caleb looked toward Lily, who stood proudly beside the restored truck with one hand resting on the familiar driver's door. "I think all of us did," he answered gently. Later that afternoon, after the guests had gone home and the last folding chair had been put away, Caleb started the old Ford once again. The familiar engine settled into its calm, confident rhythm. Lily climbed into the middle seat exactly where she always liked to ride. Victoria opened the passenger door and smiled before sitting beside them. The three of them drove slowly down a quiet country road bordered by wildflowers and newly planted cornfields, while warm sunlight stretched across the windshield. Nobody spoke for several peaceful miles. They simply watched the familiar landscape roll gently past, listening to the steady hum of an engine that had once been dismissed as worthless. Finally, Lily looked out the window and whispered, "Do you think Grandpa Charles would be happy?" Caleb smiled without taking his eyes off the road. "I think he already is." Victoria looked at the worn dashboard her father had touched for so many years, then at the quiet man beside her who had never once asked for recognition, and finally at the young girl whose hopeful smile carried tomorrow inside it. She understood then that the truck had never changed one life. It had quietly united many lives through dignity, patience, and kindness. Long after buildings grow old and fortunes are forgotten, people rarely remember the size of an inheritance. They remember the hearts that protected it, the promises that honored it, and the quiet people who proved that the greatest legacy anyone can leave behind is the simple courage to recognize goodness when it appears, even beneath a little rust.